Hello, I haven't done a video for a while. I wanted to talk a little bit about the performance principles that I put out a couple of weeks ago, in regard to growth and the adaptation phases of training. Basically, having having good perspective on what a stress is, what intensity is, and everything surrounding that, and plus the other objective is to rest properly. But what I want to talk about today is more about making mistakes. So the making mistakes category for me is a big one. We always try to look at the past and say to ourselves in the past, what have we done that wasn't productive for our training? Where did we go wrong? How did we analyse that? And I think the basic first principles of that is to always keep some sort of journal or diary in regard to what you've done and how you've progressed, but also try and have a little look on what your objective is, to what the training impetus needs to be, and whether you're fulfilling that criteria. I know from various times in the past, I've probably, as an example, I've overreached, overtrained. I spent probably 3 big occasions during me senior years out for months. Probably towards the end of when I actually packed in 2002, it basically stopped me from running for 2 years properly. And then I got into football, etc., just because of the intensity of the overtraining syndrome. And what that is, that's a general malaise. It basically, you're feeling exhausted all the time, you're tired. And that's a little bit of a background into when you've overreached, when you've overtrained. And it can be an accumulation of certain overtraining factors. So it's not one consistent image of saying, oh, every time I went training, I went to the well. And that was the case in most of the time I was like training, but I was probably training at the right intensity, but I wasn't recovering at the right intensity because of all the environmental factors surrounding that. So when I talk about history and learning from history and making mistakes, it is important that we reflect on them mistakes and making sure that when them mistakes are made, that the journal actually is honest of the appraisal about what actually did you do wrong and what actually can we do in the future to make that right. So again, we're in the sport of movement dynamics. There's a functional movement for loads of different athleticisms, and we've got to understand the nature of intensity, but also understand the nature of when we're overreaching and when we're overtraining. And these mistakes are essential for learning and growing and adapting. But I think as a coach, we've also got to start getting into that mindset of that, like we've been through that process of knowing what overtraining is, knowing what a significant amount of accumulated fatigue feels like, and understanding that we're trying to mentor and educate our athletes to get their knowledge for themselves of what overreaching is for them. A lot of different dynamics are at play here. I mean, there's a lot of athletes who can take a hell of a lot of workload. There's a lot of athletes who can take not very much workload, and we've got to make sure that we understand that these dynamics, and if we understand them as coaches during these conversations, it's really important that it's emphasized to the athletes and say, well, we know that you've tried that dynamic, and the response was good, and you seem to be growing, you seem to be getting into that mindset of, okay, I'm pushing and pushing and pushing, and there's only so much pushing that it will take before you go into that mistake category. And when I'm talking about mistakes, I'm talking about mistakes as a good thing. We're talking, we're learning from the mistakes. So I always keep saying this, and I emphasize this in training a lot. With trialing and error and things, in other words, we're trialing things with a little t, and the errors are with a little e, but we only find out about growth by doing these things. So we're always adjusting when we find out these things about ourselves. So I'll give you a first world example of my career. Basically is the dynamic you know, it's dynamically opposite to what I used to train like. My training's more smart, it's more controlled, it's informed by what I did in the past, and scarred as well by what I did in the past. I was scarred because I'd been through them overtraining symptoms for so long. It was like detrimental to my life, just not just me running capacity in sport in general. It was my life. I was sleeping 16 hours a day. I was malay all the time. I was feeling really tired. And I think we've got to try and understand when we're making these mistakes or when we're doing these errors, and they're bigger than the little e at the beginning. So I'll give you a quick history of one of the things that happened to me recently, which I know was an overreaching thing, but was difficult because we got to the situation where I was doing hill reps basically on the sand dunes, and sand dunes are unforgiving. They're a form of strength work and training. I was only doing 12 seconds of them. And what they were doing, they were encouraging great range of movement, but also a powerful stride in that movement. But what happens is when you run on sand dunes, it's probably a different dynamic with the mechanics. And what had happened is I did one session, went really well, 12-second efforts on a fairly firm sand dune. It wasn't really that soft at the time, and it went well. Recovery was really good. 2 weeks later, I did another session, used a slightly different place to do them. And what happened was that I basically got proximal hamstring tendinopathy off it. And I was recovering from the right leg proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And the consequences was I made a mistake. And the mistake I made was I changed the terrain, I changed the environment that I knew that was controllable for me. So I ended up running the sand dunes on a different, softer sand with a bigger gradient. Unbeknownst to me, it was too extreme for me. But I know now, I understand, and I can look back and go, mistake. It's then what the detriment of that is basically it stops me, it stops my biomechanics operating at a certain speed and a certain range of movement. So that's just a recent example of still making mistakes, but trying to adjust. So when we're talking about making mistakes, we can make them, but we want them to be productive mistakes that we don't keep repeating. And if we can do that, we're in a good position because we're analysing what we've done. And again, me and all the other coaches at LPS, we try to have conversations with each individual athlete before the start, and we actually give them a dilemma. The dilemma is we don't know your environment that you've come from. We don't know if you've had a busy day. We don't know all these factors. So what we do is we get feedback, and then we say to them, well, it's probably best if you're in this area of I'd say performance for tonight. In other words, it's got to be productive. There is times where we do go to the well and we really push the sessions to get the quality out of them sessions. But the whole category of this conversation is about making mistakes. We want to try and learn from our mistakes quite quickly. If we can do that, that is amazing. Because what that does for us is that informs us about where we can go at this time. Obviously, I'm an older athlete, and I've been through the mill of the young athlete, the senior athlete, and now the masters athlete. But what's happening is when we're getting our youngsters and we're putting them into conditioning phases, different movement dynamics, growth, all these different environmental factors that are changing, physiology is changing. We've got to make sure that we're prescribing, and it's not a doctor's prescription. It's basically saying, you know, this is what we want to do. We want you to grow. We want you to work hard, but we want you to be intense, and attention to detail is important when you're doing it, but it's also got to be fun as well. I always emphasize the fun aspect. We've got to try and understand the nature of the fun aspect so that we're letting the athletes grow. So what might happen is we might have an athlete who's perfectly progression, and progression never goes in a linear scale. It's always up, down, up, down, up, down, until we get to the nice little progression that we know we've learned all our key principles. And I think that's really important, learning key principles for yourself. And it is I suppose it's a self-ish sport in that capacity, that we've got to learn about ourselves and we've got to be inwardly appraising what's going on around us. As coaches, I think what we've got to do is we've got to try and identify where do we go to get that growth out of them athletes and get that learning experience, embed that unconscious um, competency within the group set. So what I'd say is that there will be things that are put in place that the athletes will be pushing for to get better. And sometimes it's better not to push for it. Sometimes it's better to just be under the category of pushing, 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 and in a state of control, but control in a way that you're progressing gradually rather than too quickly. Because we could say to one athlete, we're upping your mileage, or we're going to put the high intensity together a bit more. And what that'll do is we'll get a response and we'll see. And sometimes we've got to stop the session and we've got to say, you've done enough. We can see that things have moved. You've done a good session, but things have moved in a different direction, where I can see fatigue. I can see intensity levels in recovery are not very, they're not getting managed again. So we can just say, that's it, you've done it. We don't need to push further and further, forward and forward. I was the worst in the world for it. I trained predominantly, probably in my mid-20s on my own, and it was like trying to manage that. And I was probably addicted to the feelings of, that feeling you get when you're running just on the edge of it really hurting. And I'm probably a big proponent of that in the past. Now it's a bit more of control. It's a bit more of, let's get 2/3 to 3/4 of the session done, feeling control. Once it starts feeling out of control, we back off, or we just stop the session. But there is times where we go to sessions and it's like feeling really fatigued, feeling really tired. That is the time where we need to understand intensity levels. And when we get to that position where we're confident that it's like, okay, we've been given this task, but we can be honest and we can talk to the coach and go, I'm not feeling it tonight. And I get that all the time. And, all the other coaches get that all the time. Oh, I'm not feeling it tonight. And you then adjust and you say, okay, there's certain factors, and it doesn't matter. It mightn't be physical. It might be psychological tiredness, but they are factors, and they're factors for overtraining. They're factors for making mistakes. One big mistake in training can cause a rippling effect, and it can stop you from running. And I think, again, making mistakes by doing is important, but making mistakes by doing consistently is important not to. So that's what the message I want to get across today. Another thing as well is that when we have made that mistake and it has been catastrophic to our plans, etc., there is a building phase and a rebuilding phase. We've either got to rest, recover, or we've got to do rehab or prehab. And we've got to make sure that we're systematically not overloading our systems on the way back just to get there quicker. So everything's always about management of intensity, of duration, and of movement skills and dynamics. And I'm talking, my experience is always from an endurance point of view, but endurance in other sports, other activities like, field events and jumping events and sprint events, all these factors play a part, because we're talking about repetition, we're talking about intensity of repetition, we're talking about strength gains, we're talking about movement dynamics, we're talking about speed of movement dynamics. All these factors play a big part in how we progress our training. And we know that it's not linear. We know it's got to be up, down, up, down, up, down, 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 up. And when it gets to that stage where we're confident that we know our key principles of how we do the trial with a little t and error with a little e, then we're in a nice little sweet spot to go, okay, the foundation is there for us to build on. And then we are then looking for different ways of making an impact onto how we improve in them factors incrementally, not by fast tracking anything. So I just wanted to come on here. I mean, I'm going to call it making mistakes one step too far, and I think there's a good message in this. I'm making mistakes all the time, and I made a mistake on that sand dune. And what the message I want to put out there is that I adjusted. I couldn't run any faster than 3K pace without it flaring up. So I didn't, because my goal is to run a 10K on the track. So I know that I'm going to be a little bit limited with some of the movement mechanics that I've got. It was borne out last week. I overloaded some of the exercises, some of the muscles that I overloaded in the rehab phase, basically tightens up muscles around that. So again, I made a mistake. Was it recoverable? I don't know. I might get to the line on Saturday, sorry, and be fatigued, tired. Movement mechanics not great, um, and that's unfortunate. But that's a mistake I made about 6, 7 weeks ago that I've had to manage properly, um, and hopefully it'll pay off. But the odds are that it might be a little bit detrimental to my performance. But the challenge is that I know that I'm not running at a capacity that will inflame it anymore because of my movement dynamics for that speed. But if I was going into a speed phase now, I'd be very worried. So I'm going to have to be very calm and patient after this race to go into a phase of speed training and strength training with that in mind. So the mistake was made. The adaptation to the mistake was made. I over adapted to the mistake by doing too much last week. This week, I'm basically tapering and recovering and stretching and doing small rehab stuff as well, but only small. I'm not overloading the areas like I did last week, and hopefully I can get to the line fresh. But that's only an example. When I talk about things, it's only an example that I'm going through at the moment. But I do see athletes on the track, and day by day, and on the trail, they'll be pushing it when they shouldn't be pushing it, and sometimes they've got to know the level of control that is needed to progress further and further to get one consistency, which is the key to everything. Consistency is if you're consistent for 16 weeks rather than consistent for 3 weeks and then don't do nothing for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it doesn't work. The 16 weeks is the key, and I'm just putting 16 weeks as a training block basically. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that, yeah, we're making mistakes, we're growing our athletes, we're making sure that they're getting resilient. I mean, there was one last week where a young athlete was doing a session and the intensity was very high, and I got him to do two more of the efforts, and they were lying on the floor, they were tired, they were full out, but their intensity levels was as high as they've ever been, I could tell. But they won't do that now for another month. I'll be like, well, you know what it feels like now. You've had the understanding of what intensity is. And I think praising intensity is important, but praising it in the right manner at the right time is more important. So tonight, when I see the athlete that went to the well, I'll be saying to him, you don't need to do that anymore. I know that you've got the resilience and the intensity levels to go beyond what you think you're capable of, but now we need to control that and only go there now and again so that we can be progressive, so that they understand there's an upper limit here. But what we want to do is we don't want to keep going to that upper limit. We want to cut back on the upper limit, and we want to progressively get them into a way that they're adapting all the time and they're growing. Young athletes are growing all the time. We've got to be careful that we're not overloading them in different aspects of movement mechanics and physiology and things that are happening with them as they're getting growth spurts, etc. And these things are happening. So I just wanted to emphasize, making mistakes are good, making big mistakes are detrimental, and what we want to try and do is we want to try and diarize when it's been too much at this stage, because a big mistake at 18 might be a smaller mistake at 21 in respect of growth, strength, development, foundation. So we've got to make sure that if we're looking at these factors, we always look at the factors in relevance to where we are at. And that's the understanding of where we are at. And that's the key. The key is it's no good training for a 15 minute 5K if you're in 17-minute shape. If you're going to train at 15-minute intensity levels and you're in 17-minute shape, you are going to be totally overtraining. Again, with like throws, I'm assuming that, the throw dynamic is exactly the same. It's like probably giving a hammer to a younger athlete who can't handle them weights, or a shot put that can't handle them weights. The load is too much. So we just got to make sure that we're prescribing as coaches and as influencers and as mentors, that we're seeing what fatigue looks like, what overtraining looks like. And if we've experienced it ourselves, it gives us a little bit of a heightened understanding of what that is. And it's not nice. I'd rather be consistently in control than consistently out of control and overtrained. So I think this is a big message. I think making mistakes is fundamental. So I just wanted to get out here, get a quick one done in respect of a video, because I haven't done one for a couple of weeks. And it's just food for thought, something to take with you, diarise it, and go from there. So thank you very much, and bye.